excited to join us this morning. We hope that you will sing along with us wherever you're at, in the kitchen making breakfast or sitting on the couch still in bed. It doesn't matter. We're just glad you're here, and we hope you join us as we sing. I'm standing at your door. My heart is calling yours. Come fall into my arms. You're weary from it all, been running for too long. I'm here to bring you home. I'm reaching out, I'll chase you down. I dare you to believe how much I love you now. Don't be afraid, I am your strength. We'll be walking on the water, dancing on the waves. Look up and lift your eyes, the future's open wide. I have great plans for you. Your past is dead and gone, your healing has begun. I'm making all things new. I'm reaching out, I'll chase you down. I dare you to believe how much I love you now. Don't be afraid, I am your strength. We'll be walking on the water, dancing on the waves. I set every star into place, so you would remember my name. I made it all for you. 'Cause you are my masterpiece. You are the reason I see. This is my song for you. I set every star into place, so you would remember my name. I made it all for you. 'Cause you are my masterpiece. You are the reason I see. This is my song for you. I'm reaching out, I'll chase you down. I dare you to believe how much I love you now. Don't be afraid, I am your strength. We'll be walking on the water, dancing on the waves. And I have made mistakes, I have made mistakes, I continue to make them. The promises I've made, the promises I've made, I continue to break them. And all the doubts I've faced, all the doubts I've faced, I continue to face them. Nothing is a waste. Nothing is a waste if you learn from it. And the sun, it does not cause us. The sun, it does not cause us to grow. It is the rain that will strengthen, the rain that will strengthen your soul. It will make you whole. We have lived in fear. We have lived in fear, and our fear has betrayed us. And we will overcome. We will overcome the apathy that has made us. 'Cause we are not alone. We are not alone in the dark with our demons. And we have made mistakes. We have made mistakes, but we will learn from them. I have made mistakes, and I have made mistakes. I continue to make them, and we have made mistakes, and we have made mistakes. We'll continue to make them, but nothing is a waste. Nothing is a waste if we learn from it.
Moses had the same problem also. In fact, if it weren't for his father-in-law coming along and teaching him a better way, Moses would have probably lived out his entire leadership career leading God's people in a solo leadership model. But one day his father-in-law, Jethro, comes to visit Moses in Exodus chapter 18. He sees how Moses is leading. He sees Moses as the center of gravity in every decision. He's the one who decides when people go, when people come. He judges cases, all cases. There's thousands of cases to be decided. He sees that every decision in the organization is run completely past Moses, and he sees, he being Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, sees the impossible nature of the work Moses has wired up, the impossible task that's in front of him. No matter how God ordained or spirit birthed, it is just going to break a man and God's people unless he changes the way he leads. And so Jethro introduces Moses to the concept of the 8 to 15 a little bit differently than we talk about it. He suggests to Moses that he find men who are capable of leading thousands, and men who are capable of leading hundreds, and others who are capable of leading 50s, and still others who are capable of leading tens in smaller groups. This Exodus chapter 18 verse 21. And then what he suggests to Moses is basically what we talked about last week and several weeks now, is that Moses would identify people that God has supernaturally and strategically put into his life, invite them into a particular type of relationship. Last week we called that coaching relationship, where one person empowers another by sharing personal wisdom and resources. So Moses would do that and invest in them by giving them experiences, opportunity, by blessing them and helping them grow and thrive and flourish into spiritual leaders who can be faithful, fruitful, and multiply. Moses would have probably continued being a solo leader all on his own had it not been for his father-in-law coming along and offering him a better way. The 8 to 15 kind of idea in an Old Testament version of it. And Moses took the idea and ran. In fact, I think one of the things that he learned, and this language comes from Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky from a book called Adaptive Leadership. I think one of the things Moses learned from adapting this coaching kind of 8 to 15 model that we talked about, one of the things he learns is that he had to spend time and energy on the balcony and out on the field. Now, that's Heifetz and Linsky's language. But what we're talking about is that Moses had to realize in this coaching idea that he had to get some perspective on all his relationships, social, friends, neighbors, church, religious, whatever you want to call it, his work, his school, all the places that he interacted. He had to get some distance to find those people that God is supernaturally and strategically connecting him with, so he could identify them, so he could even have an I see and you conversation, talk about the great gifts that they had. Moses had to invest time up on the balcony at a high level, reflecting, looking at all the pieces in action, and then going back down on the field and having those conversations, issuing those invitations, spending time investing in each of those individuals. But not only that, is that Moses came to this particular question, and it's really the question I hope you'll hang on to in this through me kind of coaching idea that Moses was taught by his father-in-law. And that he also taught to Joshua, because I'm convinced, as I shared with you last week, Joshua is part of Moses 8 to 15. Joshua is part of those men that is capable of leading thousands. And you'll find that out a little bit later. Here in Deuteronomy 31, we'll see it. But what Moses goes on to do is he kind of reflects on the balcony, and he gets this question in his mind, and it's kind of a realization in the form of a question, and it's a powerful question. I hope you'll hang on to it. And it's this: what can I do to make sure that we have leadership in place? That's the question that drives a coaching kind of through me, like rancher style mindset that Moses was in, and that he taught to Joshua, and that Moses taught to his 8 to 15, and that Jesus actually taught to his 8 to 15. Is this idea of what can I do to make sure that leadership is in place? And that's the whole job of a spiritual leader in being faithful, fruitful, and multiplying. Multiplying is making sure that leadership is in place. And not just any old leadership, but faithful and fruitful leadership multiplies. And so I hope that's a question that you'll hang on to, because it's a question that I'm convinced Moses was captivated by. He continued to ask. And in fact, when he actually got to the end of his leadership cycle, Moses was really glad that he was taught to ask that question and had done the hard work of identifying, inviting, and investing in his 8 to 15. Because in Deuteronomy 31, we discover that Moses says he's getting very old. He's 120 years old, and he's not going to be able to continue leading God's people into the promised land. In fact, he's not. God's already told him he's not. But he's already told him that Moses has been investing in one of his 8 to 15 that would lead them further. And that's another reason to adopt this idea of a coaching model, is that you never know when your leadership time will be done. And you never know that who you're investing in may be the next person up, to use the sports analogy. One of the people you're investing in may be the next man up to step into your shoes and to continue your leadership, to continue the spiritual leadership that God has given you to. And take the organization, take the group, take the family, take the workplace, on to the next stage that God would have them go to. One of the people you're investing in now could be the next person to lead your organization, your church, your small group, your workplace to the next place that God's calling it to. And that's one of the beautiful things about investing and inviting. Moses had been investing and inviting and working with his own protege, his own apprentice, the next person that would lead God's people. So he knew everybody. So I'm sure that when Moses stands up in front of the whole group in Deuteronomy 31 and tells them that he's not going to go with them, but Joshua is going to do it, and he pronounces Joshua as going to be the leader. So in other words, what he probably says, it's in the Hebrew, I think. He says, hey, Joshua, don't worry about him. He knows your mom and them. He knows all the backstory. He's been around town. He knows who you talk to, who you work with, where you go, what you do. He knows all the stuff that he needs to know in order for you to follow along, which is ultimately what happens in Deuteronomy 34 is when Moses commissions, puts his stamp of approval, like we talked about last week, on Joshua. The people of God see, in fact, in 34 verse 9, it says that the people of God see that the spirit of wisdom was on Joshua, son of Nun, because Moses had laid his hands on them. And because of that, they were willing to follow the word of Moses that the Lord had given Moses and follow Joshua afterwards. All because Joshua was invested in by Moses, so that when Moses came to the end of his leadership time, the people of God didn't have to get up in arms or be all in a fright about, oh no, boss, what are we going to do now? No, there was a next generation leader who had already been developed, who had already been invested in, who already knew the systems, the structures, the plan, the vision, the mission, the values, and the strategy moving forward. That this person was in place all because Moses adopted this through me coaching leadership style that we talked about in the framework last week. So that's all kind of a recap and a few more things around the idea of the solution. The solution to the Joshua problem is coaching. And as I promised you last week, that we'd deal with solution first and we get to problem this week. So let's just get right on to the problem here. And the problem is quite simple. That Joshua did not do what Moses taught him to. In a nutshell, Joshua did not do what Moses taught him to because Joshua did not have a Joshua of his own. Again, that comes from Tim Elmore, but that's the Joshua problem in a nutshell, friends, is that Joshua didn't have a Joshua. So far as we can tell from Scripture, Joshua didn't have an apprentice. He didn't have a protege. He didn't have a mentee. He didn't have somebody that he was investing his personal wisdom and resources into, so that when Joshua's leadership time came to an end, that the people of God would have to go, what are we going to do now? Because Joshua didn't have a Joshua to pass the baton to. In fact, the people of God, and we're going to see it in just a second, the people of God were in a really bad way, and that's the whole point of us talking about the Joshua problem, is that the people of God need spiritual leadership. They need spiritual leaders who know their commission to be faithful, fruitful, and multiply, so that the confidence to move forward and to continue to be on mission in community and stay with Jesus can be engendered in all of us. There's a leader that we can point to, that we can look at, that another respected leader, spiritual leader, has invested in and said, hey, wherever you're going forward from here, here's the torch. They're going to take it. Whatever they say, that's how you should go. They're the person that you should follow. Joshua didn't do that, and it caused a horrible problem. In fact, if you read in the book of Joshua, it seems that Joshua suffered from this solo leadership model that Moses found himself in early on. But Joshua spends all his time and energy on the field. So if Moses was in the balcony getting a high-level look to find out those 8 to 15 people that God is supernaturally and strategically connected with, of which Joshua was one for Moses, Joshua never either Moses never expressed it to him, or B, Joshua just never really could get it. Or maybe C, he just didn't want to get it. Joshua never could get into the balcony to reflect onto his relationships. There's no evidence that Joshua developed those 8 to 15 people that God has supernaturally and strategically put into his life to connect with, to identify, to invite, and to invest in, so that there was a next generation of leader ready to take the reins up when Joshua's leadership time came to an end. There's just no evidence of that. And it's part of the reason that we have the problem there's just nobody that Joshua taught, trained, or had them ready to be faithful, fruitful, and multiply when Joshua's time of leadership came to an end. Joshua seems to be driven by, and this is kind of hard to believe given that all the great things that we talked about from Moses teaching to Joshua and to his 8 to 15, but this is kind of hard to believe. Joshua's not driven by what can I do to make sure that leadership is in place kind of question. Joshua seems to be driven by, how can I make sure that I remain faithful? And now this one, this might seem difficult to kind of wrestle with here, but we're going to wrestle with it for just a second. Is that question, how can I make sure that I am faithful? It sounds like a really great question. In fact, people like me through the years have encouraged you to be faithful over and over again. And we talked about last week what we mean by faithful. In part, we mean by staying in love with God and attending to the ordinance of all the things that God teaches us to do. Continue to grow in grace, in other words. So Joshua, if you read in the book, what he's doing is his whole focus, it's kind of myopic. He's only focused on the phrase that happens is keeping the law of Moses. In other words, he's focused on doing things right. And I wonder, and I'm almost beside myself when I reread it this week, I'm almost beside myself and wondering, how could Joshua miss that one of even doing things right is investing and inviting in other people, particularly whenever that's how he was groomed to be the next leader of God's people. I wonder how he missed that investing and inviting in others is at least part of being faithful. But that's kind of why this is difficult, right? Is because, as we pointed out, spiritual leadership, our commission as spiritual leaders, as those who have been redeemed by the grace of God through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and he's making us into everything that otherwise we have no hope of being. And one of the things that he's making us into is he's reforming, reshaping us into the very image for which he restored us and that we were created for. And part of that isn't for our own sake that Jesus is doing that. It's for the sake of others. He's shaping us. He gave us this commission that we'd be faithful, that we'd be fruitful, so that we could multiply. Multiply our influence, multiply the workers in the kingdom. You know, Jesus has a way of quoting that as well. He says, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. And part of the reason the workers are few is because how can I make sure that I'm faithful? How can I make sure that I'm doing things right that God's commanded and not multiplying, not being fruitful? And I think this is where Joshua gets tripped up, and this is where so oftentimes we get tripped up, is thinking that faithfulness alone is enough for us as spiritual leaders. And it's not. I know that might sound like somebody might click off and say, this guy's a heretic, and that's okay. I've got some heresies on my own here. But being faithful alone is not enough as a spiritual leader. Right? Because what we're taught as spiritual leadership is to be faithful, to stay in love with God, and to attend to everything that he teaches us, to be fruitful, right? To be fruitful. In other words, this is where Jesus talks about in the Gospel of John of abiding in him, remaining in him, staying connected with him, staying in love with God. Like these are all, they're so tightly woven you can't pull them apart, right? And that's the problem here with Joshua, is that he's pulled faithfulness apart from fruitfulness and multiplication. And we're just trying to put them all back together again, because you get this one-sided, disjointed spiritual leadership is solo leadership, where at the end of your leadership time, there's nobody else to hand the baton off to, because there's nowhere that we've been fruitful or multiplied. But back to the fruitfulness thing for just a second, is this where Jesus talks about abide in me so that you may bear much fruit. And it's fruit that will last, right? And that fruit is like Jesus himself. And so the more we abide in him, the more we have from Galatians, right? The fruit of the Spirit. There's no lemons on grapevines, and there's no oranges on apple trees, right? The more we abide in Jesus, the more fruitful we are in the world, the more faithful we are to God, the more in love we stay with him, the more fruit that flourishes on us, even though that we have seasons like farming where we have a marginal crop that comes forward. Even though there are other seasons of drought where the circumstances of life that seems to squash all the fruitfulness in our life. Even though there's other times where we experience an abundance of fruitfulness. It's kind of a up and down thing, but it's hopefully upward and to the right on the graph. Like we continue to grow in fruitfulness. We continue to grow in what Paul writes in Galatians. As we abide in Jesus, we continue to be faithful. We continue to grow in love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and most of all, self-control. Right? We continue to do that when we're not a one-sided kind of just faithfulness alone, but we're focused on fruitfulness and in multiplication, right? Because that's what we're called to as spiritual leaders, is faithfulness, fruitfulness, and multiplication. And somehow Joshua missed it, because somehow he just did not do what Moses taught him to do, that Joshua did not have a Joshua to hand the reins to. And God's people, here's really the point of all this, the Joshua problem, right? And you say, well, it's not really a problem. It's not my problem, as I've got written over there. Friends, it is your problem. It is my problem. It's our collective problem. When we don't have individuals that we have identified, that we've invited, and that we're investing in, that we're helping to grow in their own spiritual leadership, that we're the bridge to which they get closer to God, which they get near to God, which they continue to find the unending wellspring of hope, love, and life, and joy, and all things. Like it is our problem when we don't do the faithful, fruitful, and multiply. When we don't invest in them, friends, there'll come a time where when we get ready to pass our leadership baton off, there won't be anybody to take it. And in fact, that's what we see with Joshua as well. Joshua gets to the end of his leadership. He gets, this time, he's 10 years less than Moses, is his mentor. Moses was 120 when he dies. Joshua's 110. And then we get right here in the book of Judges, and I'm going to read this one to you just so I don't fumble it. This comes from Judges. Judge was twice now, not Joshua and Judges together, but Judges. Thank you. Slow down. Judges chapter 2, verses 8 through 10. Now Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him in the land of his inheritance. And here's the thing, friends. Here's the thing I want you to hang on to. Here's the whole reason why the Joshua problem is a problem, and why coaching is the solution. After that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up who neither knew the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Friends, if you want to know what's at stake, or why we talk about the Joshua problem, why it's such a big deal for me, for you, for the people of God, that Joshua didn't have a Joshua, and that why it is a big deal that Moses had a Joshua, that it is a big deal that Jesus had his 8 to 15 that he invested in, that they in turn developed other spiritual leaders, who in turn developed other spiritual leaders, who in turn developed other spiritual leaders. You want to know why it's such a big deal, why it's like on us? Is because when we don't invest in the next generation of leadership, when we don't make sure that our influence, that our resources and our personal wisdom are multiplied in other individuals where it's appropriate and as needed in those 8 to 15 people that God has supernaturally and strategically put into our life, when we don't make sure, friends, we are making sure that the future is nowhere near as bright and fruitful as it could be. In other words, when we don't invest in multiplying the next generation leader, when we don't invest in helping others grow in grace and learn to be faithful, fruitful, and multiply themselves, then the same thing that happened to the people of God then will continue to happen to the people of God now. That the next generation of leaders will come of age, will step into the opportunity to lead, and they'll neither know the God of Christianity nor the things that he can, that he will, and that he wants to do for them. In other words, we'll give the hope of another generation away because we didn't invest in the next generation by identifying those that God has supernaturally and strategically connected us with, by investing in them and inviting them to join us along the way. For friends, if you want to really know in the book of Judges how this turns out, you think, oh, well, Joshua was faithful. He just did his work. And it wasn't for him to invest in other people. I'd encourage you to go to the end of the book of Judges. In chapter 21 and verse 25, it says, in those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did what seemed right to them in their own eyes. And that's the power of investing in developing another generation and helping them to learn to be faithful, fruitful, and multiply, to helping those in your 8 to 15 learn what spiritual leadership looks like, to help them learn to be faithful, fruitful, and multiply, is so that they don't get to a point when they don't know that they have a life without a king. They don't have to continue to go without bearing. They don't have to be like a ship without a rudder, continue to drift through the waves and not know where they're going and not have any bearing, friends. They don't have to be that way, but when they don't know any better, everyone resorts to doing what seems right in their own eyes. Because no one invested in them to teach them the things of God, the ways of God, the truth, that God loves them and God wants to lavish love on them. And God has an unbelievable purpose for them and an unbelievable invitation to be made whole, to be made new, to be made well, and to be transformed, to be remade into a child of God, and to step into their leadership abilities so that they too can invest in those 8 to 15 people that God supernaturally and strategically put into their life, so that when it becomes those individuals' time to step into all God has for them, to step into a position of leading, whether it's 10s, whether it's 50s, whether it's hundreds or thousands of people, into a growing, healthy, or brand new relationship with the God who gives them all things and invites them to do exceedingly abundantly more than they can ever think or ask or imagine, that they're ready to do it. And why they're ready to do it is because they don't have a Joshua problem. They don't have another generation of people. who are doing what seems right in their own eyes because no one had taught them that spiritual leadership is about being fruitful, faithful, and multiplying. Friends, that, when we invest in others, is how we neutralize the Joshua problem.